Hey everybody, tonight we're debating the death penalty and we are starting right now with Jama Bayern's opening statement, which will be 8 minutes. Jama, thanks so much for being with us. The floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. Making even a weak argument only in principle for the existence of capital punishment is no easy or straightforward task on either moral or practical grounds. And bluntly, nor should it be when what's directly at stake is the very life of a human being, regardless of context. I hope I'm able to do so in a way that meaningfully improves the dialogue around increasing basic equity, particularly racial equity in the United States and countries that have a similarly broken punitive system, and furthermore increases the sanctions around the use of the death penalty, as well as the demandingness which we consider evidence suitable for enacting it on people. I want to begin by sketching out the shape the arguments around capital punishment have taken. The major concerns surrounding its moral permissibility are twofold. First, there is the in-principle concern surrounding under what grounds it should be morally permissible at all. The two common defenses given for its moral permissibility, and as remarked upon by multiple philosophers such as Finkelstein, Brooks, McDowell, Nathanson, and others, are the retributivist and deterrent-based defenses, which I will go on to define shortly. Roughly, one is that one ought to be punished in a lex talionis, perhaps fashion, for their crimes committed. And the other one has to do with the way in which punishment may deter future offenders. However, as Finkelstein shows, and as Sunday will be expanding upon, neither of these two justifications for capital punishment actually hold up. However, capital punishment may still be acceptable and even mandated by the conditions of the social contract in a Hobbesian sense when we're looking at the in-principle case. This is the case in which we are no longer considering the actual enaction of capital punishment within morally dubious structures or existing frameworks, but rather whether or not it ought to be made available as a punishment at all for a state that has moral right on its side, which may in fact be a condition that is not often met in the first place. My argument, however, to complement Sunday's, will be focusing more on the practical aspects of the implementation of capital punishment. I follow Tom Brooks's argument that retributivist positions around punishment, and again, Brooks et al. Are actually against capital punishment, both in practice and in principle. I follow Tom Brooks's argument that retributivist positions around punishment, even capital punishment, falling down strictly in the practical sense because of their inequitable and appalling distribution, especially along racial lines, is still merely, but importantly, a structural claim. Indeed, the argument could even be made that such punishments, when they take the form of so-called moral sanctions meted out by a state with no remaining moral authority, ought to be prohibited altogether. Even still, this doesn't necessarily commit us to abandon any in-principle position about capital punishment, including that it ought to, in theory, exist. I take this argument a step further to argue that, in fact, if we maintain that capital punishment ought to exist, perhaps on contractarian grounds, we're forced to look more carefully at the dire consequences of its existing in a system whereby the basic condition that if X be deprived of their very life, this must occur at the hands of a legitimate authority, is called into question. This may be the benefit to my argument for either side, as odious as it may be to my interlocutors in principle. There's a wonderful quote from Daniel Polsby to this end that Brooks reiterates. It states, "Being struck by lightning is cruel because it is painful and unusual, and because it seldom happens. But is it unconstitutional?" I believe that focusing in on the in-principle concerns as opposed to the practical violences and injustice that ought to unite both camps actually takes away from bringing to relief what's at stake in the misapplication of capital punishment. We may in fact only be able to bring these injustices in practice into relief by seriously considering the possibility in principle for it to be retained. Maybe then we'll see that the injustices are endemic to the system rather than the in theory practice of having to end someone's life under extreme circumstances. Before continuing, there's some terminology that's going to be important for both my argument and for Sunday's. Centralize the concepts of deterrence and retributivism. Law and philosophy professor Claire Finkelstein describes the first as a justification of punishment, only where, quotes, punishing an offender would deter other potential criminals from committing crimes in the future, end quote. And the latter as a justification for punishment only where said punishment is justified to the extent that the criminal deserves to be punished. Often in its most simple articulation, taking the form of lex talionis or law of retaliation. The major concern that Finkelstein has with the first, or deterrence approach, is that offloading deterrence onto any other human being, which is the usual track deterrence-oriented supporters of capital punishment take, is morally impermissible. What this means is that if I fail to grant a criminal clemency under the law, for instance, by not granting them bail, what ought to be governing this decision is a moral evaluation of the criminal's actions, not, as Finkelstein argues, a simple utilitarian calculation that whether I grant them bail or not may encourage or discourage someone else from offending. If we were to grant them bail at all, we would do so only whereby they themselves would not use that as an opportunity to reoffend. This aligns with the idea that we must act on someone in light of their own moral deserts and status, not in light of a third party, thus not using the person on whom we're acting per Finkelstein as a mere means in the Kantian sense. It is for this reason, too, that I can't torture someone, even if it would massively benefit a large group of people. When extended out to capital punishment, the deterrence effect of killing certain criminals in order to deter other moral offenders is therefore not morally defensible under many frameworks. Conversely, maybe the retributivist approach would be more sufficient to make the argument for capital punishment. But even if instead of lex talionis, we merely want to inflict a punishment on an offender that within moral reason in the bounds of law reflects the crime, for Finkelstein, justifying any particular act using a proportionality rationale wouldn't make sense. So, for instance, we have the moral intuition that lesser retributive acts, such as returning malicious or small petty crimes or assaults, is not justifiable. Meanwhile, placing someone in non-consensual confinement for life is. Therefore, there has to be something more powerful and morally consistent undergirding any system that allows for capital punishment, such as the existence of the social contract itself, for instance. This is a point that we'll be further expanding upon. I want to note in conclusion that even in a morally inadequate and corrupted system, punishments will be meted out. However, these punishments may be disproportionate to the crimes that they are responding to, and often cause undue suffering, both for the people that they are meted out upon and for those surrounding those people. Clearly, if we are incredibly demanding around the conditions required for depriving somebody of liberty or even life, we would find capital punishment to be a very rare occurrence indeed. One wonders in these rare occurrences whereby offenders are suddenly capable, whereby we're able to determine on the nature of offenders' crimes using things such as DNA evidence, or we know that that person is in the very rare instance beyond resuscitation into normal existence. We may, in fact, be forced into a choice between something which causes lifelong suffering and something which merely quietly and calmly ends that person's life and ensures that everything about their existence was dealt with in a fair and equitable way. These are extremely difficult moral considerations, and what punishment ought to occur in what instance in a non-ideal system, which itself is not necessarily in a place to be morally adjudicating at all, is a complex set of questions. That's pretty much summarizes my position.
Thank you very much, Jama. And what we will do is kick it over to the, you could say, against side regarding the death penalty in particular. And want to let you know as well, our guests are linked in the description, folks. And so whether you be listening via YouTube or if you're listening via podcast, want to let you know we put the links of our guests in the description box of the podcast as well. And we highly encourage you to check out the links of our guests. And so just a quick little explanation of the openings, folks. I want to let you know that it's going to be 8 minutes from each side, flipping back and forth. And so now we're going to kick it over to Dylan Burns. Welcome, Dylan, for the first time here. We're thrilled to have you. And Dylan will have 8 minutes as he'll be arguing against the death penalty. Thanks so much. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. I'm happy I finally have an opportunity to talk about the death penalty. It's an issue I care deeply about. It's probably one of my most deeply held personal beliefs. So the thing I always found beautiful about the American justice system is how from its foundation, the state tried to, in the creation of our state, was primarily focused, when it came to our criminal justice system, upon the person being accused of crime and making sure they got their issues heard, making sure they got a fair trial, and they were able to be seen by their peers before being locked away from society. And I found that to be a very beautiful thing because a lot of states really want to have a lot of power over their judicial systems. A lot of times in authoritarian governments like, say, Bashar al-Assad, Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and North Korea, the control of the judicial system is extremely important because you want to be able to lock away the people you want to. And I found it to be a very beautiful thing to prioritize those being accused. And when you consider the fact that on the low end, 4.1% of people currently on death row are innocent, it makes you ponder. I'm not saying that we should never be able to lock up somebody who is possibly innocent. Anytime we lock somebody up, you're locking someone who's possibly innocent upon further review later down the road. And as we continue to develop new technologies to investigate cases, that will continue to happen since there will be no foolproof method. But if we are to revisit cases and find out after the fact, after appeals, that these people are actually innocent, that we find out that the people that we've put to death are actually innocent, that means we're using the state to kill innocent individuals, who have not done anything wrong besides possibly being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And as much as being given freedom or told after the fact you're not guilty, dumping ashes out the window is not freedom for anybody in reality. And this is just one of many reasons why I oppose the death penalty. The next one would probably be its historical racist applications. So if you were to do any amount of studying the death penalty, you'd find out that it's been disproportionately used against black people upon any study that's ever reviewed this topic. Not only has it been disproportionately used against black people, you can look at certain institutions like Pennsylvania, which I believe it's 70 to 80%, or in the U.S. military, it's 86% of the people in the U.S. military that's been sentenced to death are actually African American. Not only is that the fact, but in fact, if there is a white victim of a crime, it is much more likely that you will be sentenced to death than if it's a black victim. Like the rest of our criminal justice system, racism is seeped in deep. And when we give the government the power to sentence people to life or death once we have confined them and they are no longer a threat to society, that racism is going to seep into convictions. This has also been used historically, even though I probably not going to talk about this. I do want to make note of this, against disabled people, mentally disabled people who have been forced convictions, were forced out of them and eventually sentenced to death. There's many really tragic cases from the 1950s and onward of this happening. And there's rare instances, it doesn't happen as much today, but it still does happen today, where certain disabled individuals around the world, even not as much as the United States, this still happens. Now, I'm framing this towards more of an American model, because it's hard to look at a lot of other countries when it comes to the death penalty, because most countries we're in line with when it comes to the death penalty are not countries you really want to be in groups with. We're talking Saudi Arabia, Bashar al-Assad, the Islamic Republic of Iran, China, North Korea, and other governments of an authoritarian nature have been using the death penalty, and they have been using it quite openly towards dissidents of the state and, of course, people who oppose them in certain manners, and, of course, just common of the way criminals. But a lot of the rest of the world has not done this. As time has gone on, they have drifted away from it because they have all realized that in reality, it doesn't seem that the death penalty seems to be a deterrent for crime. In fact, societies that abolish the death penalty statistically continue to have decreasing crime rates within their societies. And when you look at the states in the United States, like mine, Maryland, which has abolished the death penalty, there doesn't seem to be really any statistical difference between those who have abolished the death penalty and those who have not abolished the death penalty. So if it's not having any effect or deterrence, then really the only reason you would have the death penalty in place is this kind of euphoric feeling of revenge, which is certainly not the type of criminal justice system I would like to have, but I think it is the one that has led to 20% of the world's prison population existing in the United States. And speaking of Maryland, which is my home state, I have done a lot of studying about Maryland, the death penalty in Maryland before, of course, we abolished it. And even in just our state alone, which is the state I've done the most research in because it's the one I work in, I work in Maryland politics, we used to be paying $37 million per execution in the state of Maryland to actually get this done. So not only is no real deterrence done, not only is it applied in a racist manner, and not only do we use the state to kill innocent people, it's also, in many occasions, much more expensive than just housing the people we would have killed anyway. And the reason why is because we really love in this country giving people in our criminal justice system the ability to appeal, which is good, but those appeals cost money, and people are going to, of course, appeal as much as possible if they are on death row. Anyone would want to avoid death. And I would like to say, in conclusion, well, actually, no, I have 2 more points. I missed these, so let me get through these quickly. So ultimately, I do think there's going to be a few points brought against me, but one I wanted to make sure that I got out of the way right off the bat so I don't have to deal with these thought experiments is, well, Dylan, this is all fun and games, but are you telling me that said monster, the Boston bomber, Osama bin Laden, Adolf Hitler, if you would have captured them, would we have not sentenced such individuals to death? I think putting these structures in place that would have sentenced these people to death, which may have deserved it, will ultimately be abused in racist manners. When you talk to people who like house our criminal justice system, and you'll say, well, okay, we allow for Hitler. Well, then someone will inevitably, what about the serial killer? And it's like, well, the serial killer makes sense. Well, what about the brutal murderer and rapist? Well, they make sense too. And eventually you broaden this list that will eventually end to more innocent people dying. And ultimately, I would also like to say that I think having people who commit horrific crimes have to live with the reality of their decisions, then be given the relief of inky blackness, is actually something I would personally feel as a good sense of justice. When I think of the person who raped me when I was a child, I would much rather them have to live with the reality of the impact they had on society with their actions than giving them a quick out with the death penalty. And I have more I could go on to. I can go into specifics of the data. A lot of my data comes from like the University of Maryland, the University of North Carolina, and the ACLU. So if anybody would like to ask for any of my sources on my data, I'd be glad to source them to anybody who came in my community in my Discord. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan. And want to let you know, folks, no matter what walk of life you were from, no matter where you stand on this issue or all the issues we host, want to let you know, we really do hope you feel welcome here. We're glad you're here. And we are at Modern Day Debate, a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And so with that, we are going to kick it over to, thanks so much, President Sunday. The floor is all yours for your 8-minute opening statement.
Thank you, James, and very well said by Dylan. So, to begin, today, the death penalty is lawfully administered only by the state, and the modern state holds by a practical consensus the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which is really to say there exists no greater authority to hold it accountable for whatever violence it chooses to deploy. The state exists, as it were, in the state of nature, and it might seem that while our opponents are burdened with the task of constructing an argument for why the state should restrict itself from enacting a certain kind of violence upon its subjects, from the state's vantage, we find ourselves not even obligated to entertain it. It is politics which encompasses morality, not vice versa. The state defines the normal situation and may choose, or choose not to choose, as the Weimar Republic did, to deploy any methods, even exceptional ones, in order to sustain it. If anyone finds this dubious, I encourage them to read Book 5 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War to see what illustrious company they're in. However, I am betting that what unites both sides in this debate is ultimately not a justification for the state or state action, but a vision for that norm, a vision for the kind of situation that we should want to be normal. And so in a non-trivial sense, I regard this debate as an internal debate concerning whether the death penalty is compatible with a norm, an ethic, perhaps even a sense of justice that we should both like to see prevail. So to echo Jama, the state as it exists today may very well be ethically impoverished and lacking legitimacy. So the argument I'm going to present here should not be interpreted at all as an apologia for any existing penal system or government activity. Thus, I won't be defending either of the two most common justifications, deterrence or retribution, commonly deployed for harsh punishments like the death penalty, as well as lengthy imprisonment, mutilation, torture, etc., for the same reasons as our opponents will likely echo. That not only are they inadequate as justifications within that ethic, they are easily found upon examination to be odious to it. To quickly reiterate, deterrence fails because it contains no principle to limit to whom or to what extent punishments may be administered so long as they are effective in deterring further crime. While retribution fails, despite what I think is the correct intuition that the punishment should match the crime, because it contains no principle to prevent moral absurdities like administering rape to punish rape, or as it were, murder to punish murder. An example which lays spectacularly bare the limits of a retributive approach in that it finds itself only able to excessively punish small crimes while being unable to meet the worst. It is surely not a trivial part of the wrong done to a victim of rape or murder, in addition to the corporeal harm that they endure, that they were also raped and or murdered. Liberal philosophers like Claire Finkelstein, mentioned by Jama already, have proposed a corrective in the contractarian justification, which runs that just as a person consents to reap the benefits of the rules of a community, they also consent to the punishments by which that community enforces those rules. This argument avoids the aforementioned problems in that retribution is not only justified, but consented to by the punished, who have tacitly endorsed the lawful repercussions of their actions by enjoying the law's benefits, as well as successfully limiting the deterrent use of punishment only to those who deserve it. I like this argument, but it's not sufficient, and it's not hard to see why. First, tacit consent only applies where we have the freedom and the ability to choose otherwise, and in this world of increasingly closed borders and economic disparity, that's hardly a given. And second, there's still no necessary connection to extremely final forms of punishment like the death penalty or even life imprisonment. Why? Well, because there's no intrinsic reason to think that someone who breaks the social contract can't be reformed into upholding it again later. And it's possible that softer punishments might be as effective or ineffective at deterring crime as execution. This argument needs to be augmented because where it really fails is in the impoverished view of human relationships it implies by restricting the task of justice to enticing and enforcing conformity to a set of community-sustaining rules, committing, in effect, the opposite excess of the retributist, who prioritizes revenge above all else, by limiting justice to the needs of deterrence alone. To illustrate why this is a problem, consider a man in prison guilty of rape and murder who feels no remorse, for whom all attempts to convince him that he should have remorse have failed, so that a restorativist approach, is in vain, and who furthermore takes pleasure in tormenting his fellow inmates and prison attendees with gleeful and vivid accounts of his crimes, and who additionally claims to laugh every chance he gets at the horror he has wrought upon his victims and their families. Such men exist, and in my country, we are so obsessed with prolonging their lives that we forget that the crime of murder isn't exhausted by the bare fact of loss, and that the dead can still suffer. How? Human beings are rational animals. Just as our rational wills extend beyond our physical bodies in space through things like property, relationships, etc., they extend beyond our bodies in time. We make plans and have hopes for the future. Other animals can be observed to experience pain at the loss of a companion, but we experience equal pain at the loss of and affronts to their spirit. Murder isn't simply the killing of a speaking, contract-making body. It's the killing of all a soul aspired to do and be, and perhaps everyone they aspired to make. And even as a dead negative, that can still be wronged. The murderer can laugh, and by so doing stamps on his victim's will his own. Here the death penalty may present itself as not simply justifiable, but as a moral duty. Not retribution, but cessation. Not to deter future atrocities, but to terminate atrocities ongoing. Not to avenge the violently wronged or the dead, but to spare the innocent and the living, and not just the innocent living. Because this justification has an additional feature. To keep an incorrigible murderer forever caged out of an obsessive need to preserve his metabolism at all costs is to do him unfathomable violence. He is a human being and author of his actions, the results of which have been desired and chosen by his rational mind. To treat him not as a doer of wrong who could equally have been a doer of right, but as a patient, as a malfunctioning body without a will of its own, which must be hijacked by a better will, not his own, is to deny his humanity and to affront his own dignity in the same way he affronts that of his victim by laughing, and to kill his humanity and his soul for the sake of his flesh. There is as much difference between these as there is between fact and justice, and it is as abhorrent to conflate the former as it is the latter. To such a one we render not only a punishment by killing him, but an honor. This was Hegel's argument. By contrast, to hide him away with others, similarly guilty, away from the world, with no future, no human future at least, to suffer endless attempts to hijack his body with a rationale not his own through therapies and treatments, however well-intentioned, is to reduce him to a mule. You've killed him all the same. Or worse, you condemned him to a living death before his inevitable natural one, which he will meet not as a man, but as a beast. And I don't know if I have any time left or if we've gone over, but I yield whatever I've got left. Thank you.
You got it. Thank you very much, President Sunday. And we are going to kick it over to the last opening statement. But before we do kick it over to Dr. Ben, want to let you know we are pumped for this Friday, folks, as Destiny will be returning. He'll be debating Brenton, and in particular, it'll be Destiny's moral system on trial. So we are excited for that, folks, and want to remind you, hey, hit that subscribe button and that notification button so you don't miss that one live. It's going to be a blast. And so, Dr. Ben, thanks so much. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, James. So I guess, call me old-fashioned here, but I don't actually think you need a good reason not to kill people. I think you need a very, very, very good reason to kill people. Now, such reasons exist. If you're in a back alley and someone is coming at you with a knife, and crucially, you cannot stop them without killing them, then you have a very, very, very good reason. If Nazis have invaded your country and you can only beat them back by taking their lives, then again, you have such a reason. But what we're being asked to contemplate tonight is the idea of that we sometimes have a very, very good reason. We've somehow cleared that immense threshold of justification for snuffing out the lives of well-secured prisoners. And I have a hard time imagining anything that would justify that. Now, this is complicated in a couple of ways. One of which is that I think there's a way that somebody could interpret the topic of the debate tonight, on which Jama and Sunday actually agree with us. Which is that if I'm hearing correctly, I think they agree that whether or not the death penalty can exist in principle, it at least should not exist in the contemporary United States, which is not a small concession. If we're all death penalty abolitionists in the actual case, then that really narrows the scope of the disagreement. And again, I'm not certain that that's their position. I think that is, from what I've heard. I think it's worth taking a moment to circle and underline the reasons why it would follow from, I think, the things that Dylan has said, the things I think Jama and Sunday have agreed to, that the death penalty should be abolished in the contemporary United States. Because when we hear that there are severe racial imbalances in applying the death penalty, that there are numerous cases of human beings killed by the state who later turn out to be innocent, and so on, some death penalty apologists respond by saying that these are reasons to just, say, okay, look, these aren't reasons not to have the death penalty. These are reasons just to reform the criminal justice system as a whole. After all, the same factors can lead to unjust or excessive imprisonment, just like they can lead to the death penalty. So we wouldn't solve the problem by just abolishing the death penalty. And fair enough, we do very badly need to reform the criminal justice system as a whole in some very deep and radical ways. But all of this is a reason for the United States, at least, not to have the death penalty, in the same way that if you have an aged relative named Sam who wants to keep a gun in his home for the sake of self-defense, and you're trying to decide whether to let him do that, and for a fact that Sam is half blind, extremely paranoid, more than a little bit racist, and has repeatedly shot at the mailman, all of that, even if you think some people should be allowed to have guns in their house for the sake of self-defense, all of those would be really good reasons not to let Sam have a gun in his house. Now, I would argue that the issue about unjust conviction is not just a reason that the United States should not have the death penalty. It's a reason that no possible future country, no society should have the death penalty. I'm a socialist, but you're not going to find me claiming that in some future socialist utopia, nobody is ever going to be wrongly convicted. Human institutions are just too fallible for us to be able to be confident that this is ever going to be the case. And someone sentenced to life in prison who's exonerated decades later can at least get part of their life back, whereas without resurrection for the dead, there's simply no equivalent for capital punishment. Another way that this debate has been complicated, given the opening statements, is that the reasons that almost everybody who supports the death penalty are reasons that the other side has disowned. That standard defenses of the death penalty involve some combination of retribution, and deterrence. And we've heard that Jama and Sunday don't actually believe in either of those things. I would argue that if you listen closely, what Sunday said at the end did sound pretty retributive-ish to me, but he at least says that he doesn't. But since, again, almost anybody who supports the death penalty is going to support them for this reason, it's worth thinking through some of the reasons beyond the Kantian ones that they mentioned that these don't hold water. So, as Dylan has mentioned, the statistical evidence for deterrence simply isn't there. States with the death penalty do not, in fact, have lower murder rates than states without the death penalty. Countries with the death penalty, like Canada, where our opponents both live, don't have higher murder rates than countries without the death penalty. It's just barely possible that there are confounding factors masking some real deterrence effects. But even if that were true, it wouldn't matter. If a combination of different economic circumstances and no death penalty can bring about a lower murder rate than we'd have with the combination of a death penalty with the economic conditions prevailing to death penalty states, then the moral imperative to pursue an economic strategy for lowering crime rather than resorting to a barbaric practice like the death penalty to achieve the same end would be overwhelming. Some death penalty proponents, and again, I'm glad our opponents, haven't stooped to this, try to argue that we have good intuitive reasons to guess that the death penalty works as a deterrent, even if that doesn't show up in the statistics. So there is something that you often find in essays defending the death penalty, where, they'll make this analogy, well, the death penalty is like a lighthouse. We only know how many shipwrecks there are. We don't know how many ships are saved by lighthouses. But of course, if we rip down all the lighthouses on the West Coast and kept all the lighthouses on the East Coast, we would have excellent statistical data very quickly on how effective they were or they weren't. So as far as retributive desert goes, this is where my opponents seem to be the most ambiguous, at least to me. Maybe it'll be cleared up later. Because we still heard, we heard that the punishment should fit the crime, and so there still seems to be some idea that even if it's not exactly about retaliation, that people should be punished in kind, which they've disowned, that there should at least be some sort of proportionality principle, and this is part of why we should have the death penalty for the worst offenses. Now, I know I'm running up to time, so let me just quickly say that to see why there's no straight road from the worst crime should get the worst punishment to the death penalty should be among the array of available punishments, forgive me, this is too silly, but think about the classic film, The Princess Bride. At the end of the movie, Wesley challenges the prince to a duel, not to the death, but to the pain. He starts out describing what this means, and he says the first thing you lose will be your feet, then your hands at the wrist, followed by your tongue, and then your left eye. And the prince interrupts, and he says, and then my right eye, and then my ears. We gotta get on with it. Wrong, Wesley replies. Your ears you keep, so that every shriek of every child shall be yours to cherish. Every babe that weeps in fear at your approach, every woman that cries, dear God, what is that thing, will reverberate forever in your perfect ears. So, should the justice system include a to the pain punishment? Well, if you going on this principle that that the worst crime should get the worst punishment, that the punishment should fit the crime in that sense, you might think so, because after all, not all murders are even created equal. Some are much more savage and depraved than others. And so you might think that the lesser murder should get the death penalty and the worst murder should get this. And of course, what this silly example shows us is that what the principle that the worst crime should get the worst punishment doesn't really tell us a thing about what that worst punishment should be. Just like we'd all presumably agree that the to the pain punishment should not be on the books, I think we would argue on our side that the state should not have the power. No human institution should have the power to take the life of a well-secured prisoner. Nothing would justify that.
All right, we will jump into the open conversation, folks, and want to give you a friendly reminder. All of our guests are linked in the description, so if you want to hear more, you can hear more by clicking on those links. We appreciate our guests. Want to remind you, friendly reminder out there, we want you to attack the arguments rather than the people. So thanks so much for being your friendly selves out there, and we'll jump into open dialogue. The floor is all yours.
So, Jama, in your opening, I heard something about the social contract. In Sunday's statement, it seemed like he was contemplating a social contract-based argument for the death penalty, but I wasn't quite clear on whether he was dismissing it entirely or just saying that that this doesn't give us the whole reason, for the death penalty. But would one of you like to expand on that argument?
Well,
Josh, you wanna go?
Ben, I'm gonna have Sunday kind of expand on his argument. His argument is slightly different than
Okay.
mine, and kind of talks about the in-principle case versus mine talks about some of the nuances of what things would look like in practice and why it may not be tenable currently. I had a few things I wanted to discuss with you in a more kind of fine-grained way. So maybe I'll have Sunday open and then I might follow up if that's all right.
Sure, but just to be clear, like was your argument, because both of you spent a lot of time talking about all the arguments for the death penalty that don't work, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
But I heard a lot less about which arguments do work. So I kind of got a humanitarian argument from you at the end.
Yes.
Uh,
So what I would say in relation to that is that Sunday's in principle case for the fact that there may be instances in which the death penalty may still obtain in these kind of extremely rare and specific instances forces us to think on a practical level, using a kind of pragmatist approach almost, about the nature of the injustices in the current system. It's not just, oh, we should think about them instead. It's that even, there's a sort of tendency in philosophy, which I think is actually not a terrible one, which is to say, if I were to try to support this almost intolerable thing, and I were to still find some reason why I couldn't just completely dismiss it, that, if I put pressure on that point, is going to reveal what's troubling about the system overall. And so on a practical level, what I'm concerned about, the proportionality rationale definitely comes into play in terms of retribution arguments. I don't think the state is a legitimate moral authority as it stands. And so the idea of it engaging in a retributive act strikes me as absurd. Even more so, an individual having a desire for that kind of act to kind of back up that sort of rhetoric strikes me as doubly absurd. However, the only part of the proportionality rationale that I want to maintain that I think is interesting is that we want to make sure that the response to a crime doesn't lead to mindless suffering and worsening of conditions overall within the existing system. I ideally would not want to see a heavily morally illegitimate state, a compromised state, mete out punishment. And yet, if that state is not meting out capital punishment, it's meting out other punishments instead. And we need to be sure that there is something uniquely awful about capital punishment compared to, for instance, putting someone in solitary confinement and causing extraordinary undue suffering to them and the people around them for life, for instance. And we also need to make sure that we know why one is appropriate and why the other one isn't. By forcing us to consider capital punishment and keeping it on the table as a possible response, we're forced to consider what's uniquely awful or not awful about it. And my argument is that there are actually things worse than capital punishment on a practical level, and revealing what happens when we look at this in terms of the souls and the meaningful nature of people's existences beyond merely, bad thing happened, now we need to fix it. This happened, now we need to deter it from happening else. When we actually look at what's at stake for people, we start to realize there are things far worse than death. And so basically, I'm taking Sunday's in principle stronger stance and applying it in a weaker sense to a system where really there's no legitimate moral authority to mete out any punishment. But if it's going to mete out punishment, there's nothing in my mind that makes capital punishment the worst punishment that could be meted out. I think there are worse things currently existing. So that's kind of in extreme cases. And again, I would take the instances of meting out capital punishment down to basically one in maybe every 100 years. And I would only want this to occur if we had empirical evidence, like DNA testing, that person was actually there and had committed the crime. And we had number of years of very, very careful empirical research into the fact that person could not be brought back or resuscitated into a functional stance again. And if we knew they did it, and we knew that it was the rare instance where we couldn't do anything to rehabilitate them, then I think there are things worse than death. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'm making a very case for a very rare application of this.
So do you think that we could
just to add to that quickly,
Okay.
and again, like, these rare cases are exceedingly rare, and I would agree with anyone who says that we should absolutely limit the death penalty to an absolute tiny stringent minority of cases, but there are cases that do fit the bill. Jeffrey Dahmer is a paradigmatic one, where we do in fact have both conclusive evidence and a confession, and a remorseless culprit. So it's
may I just add one addendum to that? I think
Please.
it's unacceptable at this point, given that we have DNA testing, to convict anyone in such a way as ensures either brutal isolatory lifetime imprisonment or the death penalty without effective DNA testing such that we know they committed the crime being in place first. Like, I think that has to be in place.
You said that a couple times about, like, we know they committed the crime given DNA testing. But of course, it is it's not uncommon, like many of the cases of innocent people who have been executed, that there is some method of physical evidence about which, like, crazy amounts of confidence were projected, that you had some, you had expert witnesses come and say, no, given this bit of, given DNA, given other things, we could be really sure. And then it comes out, 20 years later that there was a whole string of people who were convicted based on this, and it's actually not very good.
So I want to say you're totally right about that, but the only addendum to that is that, so then think about this, that person might be imprisoned for life in solitary confinement in horrific conditions. This is a problem about how we judge certainty, period, across the board, not just in relation to capital punishment, all other sorts of punishments, severe punishments the state could mete out. And so I think that that's an important consideration, and one that we ought to think about when we realize the state is still severely punishing innocent people in ways that are, in my opinion, worse than death. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I know Dylan wants to get in on this, but I just want to really quickly say, I'm not, I think that one reason, why capital punishment would be worse than life in prison, which I don't think should be equated with life in solitary confinement. I mean, I think that we have an actually existing, judicial systems. I think that there are many countries that don't do that. So there's no reason that the options should be limited to death penalty or solitary confinement. But as far as just life in prison, taking out the solitary confinement aspect, like, one pretty straightforward reason why the lack of certainty would be more troubling for death than for life imprisonment. Is if you have 20 years into a life term, if the conviction is overturned, then that person can still get some of their life back, whereas once the death penalty has been applied, it's irreversible.
The problem here is that so much is resting on this absolute denial of there being a possibility of certainty, and there are simply cases where we do have certainty.
Well, I think that the question isn't so much whether certainty can exist in any case, but what you want the rules of the system to be, because the threshold can't be DNA evidence for the reasons that we're talking about. That can't be the threshold for certainty if we're coming up with rules rather than just thinking about instances. If the threshold is that some decision maker feels very, very, very sure, we know that can't be the threshold either. We have too many real life cases of convictions being posthumously overturned where that held. If the threshold is a confession for reasons that Dylan mentioned and other reasons, that can't be the threshold either, because we have too many real cases of life cases of false confession. So I wouldn't deny that there are instances in which I would feel certain, and I don't think it's irrational to feel certain. But when we're talking about the design of institutions, we want there to be clear rules and not just judgment calls.
But I mean, that is a clear rule. That's a black and white distinction. Do we have certainty or do we not?
Well, no, but where I'm saying that you don't have a clear rule is when we have certainty, right? What's the rule for what legally counts as having certainty?
The thing is, what always will happen is there's a new technology in criminal justice. Be like, well, now we have video evidence, or now we have they just told us straight up.
But then why punish anyone for anything at all?
Well,
the
that's
thing is,
already
because the thing
been
is,
established.
I agree, because we need to have some sort of punishment on the whole to protect society, because because there's a really good chance that when we convict somebody, they were guilty of the crime. Vast majority of the time, that's the case. Well, let me finish. This is the first time I've talked since my intro.
Go for it.
But having a safety kind of trigger in place, that if it turns out on further review after the fact that they were innocent, then we can always pull the lever to let them out of prison. But if they're dead, that's impossible. And when we give the state the power to kill people, we always we'll say, well, in certain instances, we need to do it when we have irrefutable proof. When somebody's put on death row, that's the state assuming we have irrefutable proof, that we're pretty damn confident that this person was guilty. When we get convictions, that's supposed to be the case. But historically and presently, that doesn't seem to be the case. When I said 4.1% of people on death row are innocent, that was the lowest possible number. That's at least 4.1% of people on death row are innocent. That's not a number any nation should be proud of, and I don't see how keeping it, how we could really move that number down to an acceptable margin.
So, Dylan, part of the difficulty that I'm having is I basically mostly agree with you. So the debate that we're having right now is, should 0.000000001% of people actually be positioned such that they are up for capital punishment versus should zero be in that position? And what's at stake in terms of suffering and long-term consequences for both parties and reversibility concerns? So the problem that I'm having is there's also a practical intuition that when you deal with things like when you deal with things like the criminal justice system in the United States, that people are not predisposed to want to dispense with capital punishment over other types of punishment. So here's more of a pragmatist argument, right? Given that that's not the case, massively limiting the conditions under which this could ever occur and increasing the demandingness constraints to the point that almost nobody ever in 100 years is actually up for this, may be the most effective way of actually limiting and radically transforming and moving the system towards a more just mode of existing, and actually to help restore, in fact, state legitimacy. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing to Ben, and this is actually like a good faith question. I'm not going to run around for the rest of my life necessarily never changing my position ever. I want to actually ask this question, seriously consider this one concern, because when it comes to the nature of suffering, yes, obviously it's not just, it would be a false dichotomy to say, oh, well, solitary confinement or they'll die. So which one would you choose? I'm not going to do anything sleazy like that. I don't think that's what's at stake. But in the instance in which a person suffered inordinately in prison and everyone around them suffered and everything about their life was meaningless, and they were finally released, and we know for a fact there's not going to be rehabilitation available to most people in a reasonable way. We know the way prison systems operates currently, they break people. I mean, I'm a huge fan of rehabilitation over punishment. I think the way that prison systems exist currently is disgusting and repulsive and basically corporatocratic, right? So in the instance in which that person is released, is the rest of what they could live through until they die necessarily better than if they had simply been given the death penalty in that instance? Like in that one rare once in 100 years instance where we basically almost knew, to the point of having, to the point that we could say it's a justified true belief across every analytic, empiricist, a priori framework across every crossable philosophical system and practical and scientific system, that person was guilty. And that one instance in 100 years, it turned out that they weren't. And then that person was released after a lifetime of suffering, because that person in particular would be the inmate who would probably be in solitary, who would probably be in those conditions. So, in that one instance, would that still be better than if they had died peacefully without suffering? So that's the question.
Well, was that proposed to me, or
you
that's supposed to them? But anybody can answer it. I'm actually earnestly asking that, because I wanted
to answer the first question first.
I'll give my answer, but Dylan, if you want to go first.
Yeah. So I wanted to answer the practicality argument, the idea that, well, people in the United States, I think it's a little bit, but the statistics are clear that the majority of Americans are okay with the death penalty existing. My state, among other states, though, have abolished the death penalty for many of the reasons I've brought up. There's been a lot of activism around it. I believe Joe Biden has put it on his agenda to end it on the federal level, and I think the narrative is shifting generally on the argument, because I think when we look at our criminal justice system, and I apply the arguments I've given here today, I think most people will reconsider the position, hopefully. But if the argument is that, and a practicality's sake, to win over some of the people who don't exactly want to completely get rid of it, but limit it, that we limit it now, I'd be fine with that as a step into the eventual abolition of the death penalty. For practicality's sake, I can understand somebody making the argument that, well, first we should limit the effects of the death penalty because we can't abolish it at the moment. So let's pass this law, which makes it so we can only apply it to people accused of like some of the worst criminal offenses physically possible, that it has to like be terrorism or something along those lines. And then eventually use that as a jumping off point to abolish the death penalty. If the practicality argument's there, then I could agree with you on using it as a strategic goal to eventually get to the death penalty. Now, when it comes to the idea of for suffering for all this time in prison and or death penalty, I would make the argument, of course, I don't like the idea of putting somebody in prison on the idea of the goal is to make them suffer. And I think we both agree that the goal should be rehabilitation. The reason why we have 20% of the world's prison population, while only 6% of the world's population, is because we have the most prisoners of any nation in the world, including China, which I think is absolutely off the walls, is because we don't have an extremely rehabilitative system. And so I would hope under my system that I would be proposing, which would not include the death penalty and not include this kind of suffering that we're doing, this type of idea where we throw somebody in a cell, we throw away the key, and then we all make jokes about them getting raped in prison, which is the current culture we have around it. I would like to do away with it. But if your argument is about just suffering compared to death, I am somebody who is a proponent of death with dignity. And if somebody, this is just generally, this isn't just opposed to prisoners, if somebody was suffering so much that they wanted to end their lives, say with cancer or something like that, I could be kind of maybe debated into a position of being like, I feel like they could be able to make the decision to end their own life, which if there was an idea like a prisoner was so torn up by being confined that they couldn't do it, it was psychologically damaging to them, I could see a scenario. But again, we're doing pretty abstract hypotheticals here, where a death with dignity might be an option, but they would have to make the decision, not the state.
If I may interject, may I interject on that point quickly?
That last part, I did just want to make sure before too many minutes pass between the question that I answered Jama, and so first thing I want to say, just so there's no worry about evasion or anything, just so it's clear, is would getting the rest of their life back under that circumstance be better? And the answer, I think, is absolutely yes. But I also wanted to go back before expanding on that to something that Jama said at the beginning of the question, which is that what we're talking about is like a 0.01 percent application of the death penalty. And this goes back to what I was talking about with Sunday a minute ago, which is that I really want to know what these rules are going to be that are going to guarantee that it's kept down to 0.00001%, right? So you could do the equivalent of what the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud did and said, like, oh, you can only kill people if there are such and such many witnesses who saw them do it directly, and things like this, where basically the goal is to guarantee that nothing that really happens will ever count. But of course, that's just a sort of a cute way of abolishing it, entirely. So that's a distinction without a difference. You could do things like limit it to certain categories of crimes. You could say that we only have the death penalty not for ordinary murders, but for genocide, something like that. Although I certainly don't think that would capture the sort of cases typically that would be that the in principle case that Sunday is making would apply to. But I'm just very skeptical that there are going to be rules that you can use to capture the cases of genuine certainty and exclude all of the cases of apparent but not real certainty that afflict us in the real world. And again, I do think that the reversibility concerns give us a good reason to say, given uncertainty, there is a difference in principle between the death penalty and other punishments. But just real quickly to expand on the yes, I think the point that Dylan ended with is exactly the relevant one. So the question is, like if you're doing the executed person a favor by executing them, because their life would be so miserable for these decades in prison, or so miserable that even the remaining 10 or 20 years or however long they had after they got out of freedom would it just wouldn't be worth it. Then I think that should be up to them. As a matter of fact, most people don't think that being executed as opposed to being sent to prison, even the kind of hellhole prisons that we actually have in the United States, that I take it all four of us agree are utterly unacceptable. But even with those prisons, it's not the case that most people facing the death penalty would view the death penalty as opposed to life in prison as doing them a favor. I know there are very occasionally cases where that's true, but in the overwhelming majority of cases, people facing the death penalty will fight with everything they have to get life in prison, imprisonment instead. And people who have gone through decades, of imprisonment and see a chance to get out will fight with everything they have to get that. And I'm just not comfortable second guessing them and saying that no, you really would have been better off if you were dead. If that's what we want to do, perhaps we can allow people to kill themselves. But making that decision on their behalf that it's more humane to kill them, I think takes us back to the sort of core moral rot, at the heart of the very idea of having the death penalty as a punishment, which is this idea that that society or the state, owns the person, and and they should have total control over them, even to end their life, which I think is just in principle more power than any institution should ever have over anyone.
Yeah, I disagree with that categorically. So to a certain extent, we're talking past each other here. We were very careful at the onset to distinguish between the principle and the practical problem. The practical problem,
I acknowledge that.
You covered admirably. So but hang on. So you covered the practical principle admirably. There are a lot of problems with how it's done today. There are a lot of inefficiencies and whatnot. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we solved all that. You still have the in principle problem of, if you have this case, the Jeffrey Dahmer type case, should we keep him alive indefinitely while his existence and his own behavior torments the people around him and the people he's left to suffer as a result of his crimes? And I think absolutely not. And to counter that statement, what I've heard so far is that for whatever reason, you're perfectly fine with tormenting a person's soul in prison for 50 plus years, but God forbid anybody touches his body. That strikes me as very strange.
Well, that's obviously a silly straw man that has nothing to do with anything anybody has said.
No, that's what you were doing.
No, it's not. That's something you made up to explain it to me. I don't know where you're getting it.
Furthermore, I was actually quite clear. The reason why I brought up the contractarianism, and the reason why we spent so much time dispelling the idea that deterrence and retributivism, were viable arguments, is specifically to separate them from the argument that we were making, which is not retributivist at all. The point is that when a person is part of a society, they contract not just as a body, but as a human being with human dignity and the right to choose. When we put a person into prison and we decide that in fact, in response to his actions, we are actually going to try and change the person interminably, in effect, putting him into a trial until the end of time, until he dies naturally, we are dehumanizing him to a degree unfathomable. In fact, that is the greatest expression of state power I can imagine, far greater than killing him. What the tiniest society finds themselves forced to do under extreme circumstances. Like I'm just not seeing how you're actually answering our objections here.
Well, I mean, I really haven't heard very much about those objections. Like, this is part of the thing that makes this confusing, that we got a few minutes at the end where the considerations that you do find powerful for having the death penalty were briefly gestured at. The overwhelming majority of the time was spent disowning standard arguments for the death penalty. But let's talk about the Dahmer case. So I think first of all, the idea that if we could get rid of all the problems about certainty, the death penalty would just be justified, is a uninterestingly vacuous hypothetical, because we can't. No human society possibly could. But as far as the idea
that's a hypothetical,
that it's, well, okay, but it's a hypothetical that's it's not just a counterfactual, it's a counterpossible. It's impossible.
That's what you are doing when you say that, well, we can't have the death penalty because we may find in some point in the future that every single case has been a false accusation despite a preponderance of evidence and a confession. not just a confession, but also behavior that expresses
Okay.
gleeful pride in the crime.
Could I just step in really, really quickly
Please.
on this, Sunday? Okay, so basically, in terms of me and Sunday, I'm making a weaker. I'm supporting a weaker argument, like the weaker case, philosophically speaking. So, in other words, like I'm not as how to describe it. I'm not talking as much about the in principle distinctions and investments that go into retaining capital punishment as Sunday is. But what I am doing is I'm saying that I'm taking his discussion of Hegel's notion of what constitutes kind of the worst sort of suffering you can inflict on somebody who's committed a crime that in many senses may actually violate the social contract, and what the consequences of that would be, and using that to wonder if there's some arbitrariness around getting rid of capital punishment over another form of punishment. I think, Ben, you've discussed pretty extensively how in that there are things that are unique about capital punishment. I may disagree with you on that, but there is one point that you brought up that I thought was really excellent in practice, that I wanted to address in response, which is that, okay, so if we're going to differentiate between the 0.00001% death case and the none whatsoever on principle, how do we establish the conditions of knowing what's appropriate in that instance? Like, how are we going to actually be able to work on that or think about that or manage that? And the kind of moral intuitions that Sunday is bringing to bear on this are the intuitions that a lot of people have. And so it's one of these things that one has to consider the moral consequences when an odious act is committed for people who are not immediately and directly, who are not the person who has immediately committed that act, and also the sort of consequences down the road for other people in terms of how we treat the person who's committed that act. And so I think the practical consideration of how would we ever be able to adjudicate or deal with that or have the kind of evidence that we require is an important one. But I think that we are still nonetheless giving arbitrary status to a person being executed on the basis of having murdered multiple people or done something that we believe we know to have occurred, over the moral status of other types of suffering, of other types of structures that could be put in place, of other things that could be done to that person's body or existence or life, or those of the people around them. And so I do think there's still a bit of an arbitrariness concern that needs to be addressed. Although I want to say, I take your point that, to be able to determine that we would know this beyond a shadow of a doubt in a legal sense even, is going to be an extreme challenge. And part of that extreme challenge, part of what's entailed in that extreme challenge is how, on what a limited basis we would actually be able to actually meet that criteria, right? So I did want to acknowledge that, but I also wanted to say that I'm still not fully sold on the arbitrariness with which we are taking capital punishment to be utterly unique, right?
Okay, so I don't think it needs to be utterly unique for there to be reasons to abolish it that don't apply to other punishments. Okay. I think that one reason to abolish it that doesn't apply to other punishments is the irreversibility. I mean, that seems like a really powerful consideration to me, and I think the question about how to design the rules is a really crucial one, because whether because there are two respects in which I think you and Sunday are making slightly different arguments. There are two respects in which we're talking about uniqueness, right? One is the sort of uniqueness of the degree of certainty that you can supposedly have, right, in some cases, and the one is the uniqueness of like the heinousness of like the ongoing attitude of the person. And I would just point out that when you're designing rules, okay, they can be executed if they've confessed. That stands as a sufficient certainty. That's the sort of rule that you could have in an actually existing system. But they can be executed if their attitude exhibits gleefulness, seems like a much slipperier thing, in terms of the degree of clarity that we want for actual rules. As far as the dehumanization argument, I would say that, first of all, if you've just decided that somebody will never morally reform, you've just decided that they'll never change their attitude and they'll never feel differently because it's been too long, and so you're just sure that it won't happen. It seems like that is what's reducing them to the status of something that does not have free will. If you're treating them as a person,
look, okay.
then that possibility would always have to be left open. Also, this idea that
Jesus, man,
life
on and on.
imprisonment necessarily means an eternal campaign for rehabilitation, it's just not true. That they have that you could say, even if for the sake of argument we were giving up on the very possibility of rehabilitation, we were deciding, nope, you don't have free will. You aren't a person who with autonomy.
All right, just to be sure. So if you're in maybe like 20 seconds, Ben, if you're able to wrap up this point.
Even if you did decide that, you could still say, no, this is a human being who has certain inalienable rights, including the right to life. So we can keep people safe from him by keeping him in prison. But there are things that we may not do to him.
Okay, Ben, you categorically misunderstood the argument. The problem is not that we've decided arbitrarily that a person cannot be reformed. The problem is that a very tiny minority of persons on death row are actively engaging in pernicious activity, not just pernicious activity, but undignifying activity to the dead, to the families of their victims, and indeed to themselves. Additionally, this is a very strange and arbitrary distinction you're making with respect to reversibility. Tell me, Ben, if at the end of a person's life that would have progressed for approximately 10 years later is cut short by the death penalty, or if a person loses 10 years earlier because he has been detained wrongly early on, how is the one more reversible than the other? Explain this to me. How does one get a decade back? It's an arbitrary
distinction. It's just that you're refusing to acknowledge the actual distinction, which is that once part of the sentence has been carried out, the rest of it can still be negated in one case, whereas in the other, it's binary. Once it's been carried out, it's carried out.
That is the case for both. You still lose the time. The distinction
that's why I said part. You may have missed that word. Part of the sentence has been carried out.
So your prejudice is just
the rest of it could be, the rest of it can still be negated. Whereas in one case, it doesn't come in degrees. Right. You have either been killed or you have not.
If I may just add an addendum to what Sunday just said, is that all right, Sunday?
Please.
Okay. Basically, so when we were talking about the uniqueness, I think that Ben, you were making an important distinction between kind of the uniqueness of different things at play here. Clearly, we're not just talking about one thing, but we're talking about uniqueness. So there's something unique about the degree of certainty that's coming into play. There's something unique about aspects of the non-rehabilitation component. The other thing too that I wanted to question is there something uniquely awful about the irreversibility condition compared to any other form of suffering or anything else that could be enacted, or the suffering that could be caused not just to the person who committed the crime, but as Sunday's been arguing in somewhat stronger principle terms than me, the broader community, break down the social contract, even under horrendous conditions, etc. So I kind of wanted to maybe discuss the kind of the uniqueness of the irreversibility condition a little bit more.
One moment, Ben. Before
it's just a relevant disanalogy, but I know Dylan has been wanting to talk for some time.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this idea earlier, and it was kind of scrolled over. I don't know if we all accepted it, but the idea like victims get this like healing through the death penalty. This idea that once you pull the switch and you fry the dude or woman, I'm inclusive on murderers, then this healing comes. But I have not seen any data to suggest that, and in fact, the data I have seen suggests the opposite.
Wonderful, neither have we. We're in agreement.
Great. So, okay, I just thought you said earlier, for the victims, we.
No, not at all. Okay, so just for clarification, if I may, and I'll let you talk afterwards because I know you have been waiting. My argument is that in the event that you have a situation where the person in prison has no hope of being released, has no hope of being what's the word I'm looking for, restored. And is engaging in ongoing and, as far as we can tell, ceaseless pernicious activity, harming the people around him and harming by the knowledge of the fact that this person is laughing at having gotten one over his victims who can no longer retaliate in any way or gain back their dignity or their lives, that the death penalty in this case acts as a measure to cease that harm, and purely to cease that harm. As an alternative, if you see any difference in this, I would be perfectly content if we swapped out the death penalty with a drug-induced dreamless sleep of interminable length. Whatever you prefer.
So I don't think that a continued life constitutes a harm to the family.
But that's just being insensible to the point I made.
I'm sorry, but I thought you're saying that
the
death penalty removes their ability to continue to do harm to the family. Where I think the internment
not
of the
just
individual,
the family, also the people around them.
Well, the thing is,
There are actually quite a few cases of people who have had to be moved around, in Canada in particular, who have been let out and later committed
Last
rape.
point, and then
But
I want to hear
beside
from
the point.
Dylan.
okay.
Sure, please.
So I just wanted to be clear, like from the studies I've seen, like particularly from the University of Michigan, what ends up happening, particularly for the victims, is that many of them end up being like, oh, I don't know why I thought this would bring my family member back, or oh man, this didn't help at all, and it's like they're directing their emotions towards this quest to like slay this monster, then the monster's gone, but all the pain's still there, and nothing is solved through that. And so I don't see how them, if they're confined from the family, how that could at all be of any damage to the family whatsoever.
Well, it's not entirely true that people are entirely confined to the family. People on death row or people in serving long sentences can make constant appeals, and the family has to address those. Secondly, we get reports of what happens in these prisons. There was an infamous case locally, named a person called Cruz Wellwood, who had to be moved around because after raping and murdering a girl at his school, he was then bragging about it to people, his fellow inmates, and he had to be isolated from them because he was tormenting them and disturbing them with these stories. Like, this is, I mean, if those people felt that revenge would get them any sort of succor, that they were mistaken, and I'm deeply sorry for them, but that's not the argument that we're making here.
So okay. Could you say the first argument one more time? You said
God.
you made two arguments. You said one, and then you said the person being moved around. Oh, appeals. Okay. So the thing is, if someone appeals and then gets out, that's how it's supposed to work. And the idea that we could have sentenced that person who appealed and got out to death instead. Well, if they appealed and got out, that's good. That's the system. That's how the system's supposed to work.
No, you misunderstand me. There's for example, if in Canada you are convicted of a capital crime, you can continue to appeal until the day you die. And the problem with that is that this includes people who have been confirmed guilty. We have multiple cases of murder rapists going to prison for that, having been confirmed to have that, serving out their sentences, leaving, and then committing the same crime again. Now, that, of course, is on an individual basis, a deterrent argument. But the point is that there is no strong actual like separation between these people and the rest of the community. They aren't isolated interminably. And unless you're going, unless you actually just want them to suffer indefinitely in prison as a contrast, which doesn't strike me as a mercy compared to the death penalty.
Well, I would say that the best thing to do would be to, so the idea is that these people might one day get out of prison and then they might do everything.
No. That's not the issue. The point is just that there's not actually a solid, concrete distinction or separation between them and the wider community. We still communicate with them. Their doings in prison still reach our ears and our eyes. Like, they're not just in a separate universe away in a dungeon dimension somewhere. They still exist.
Like their existence, because we can still peer in, could end up hurting people because
we don't just peer in. The point is, with respect to the appeals and whatnot, is that these people can actually project outwards. Like, we know of this. Like,
yes, but the appeal system, and I would say that any harm that could have been done by the fact that people can appeal is easily outweighed by the importance of people being able to appeal to the system and actually have their cases reviewed. One actually data point I didn't bring up earlier is how the reason why I keep seeing at least 4.1% on death row, and that's the lowest number possible, is because when people are killed, usually there's no reason to actually review their case afterward. Like, if they're dead, like, woohoo, you're free, and you pour the ashes out the window, like, what do you do? And so the importance of having the appeals process is another check on making sure that people in our prisons are not innocent and they're actually guilty of those crimes.
So,
hang on. Sorry, John.
Sorry, Dylan. I just wanted to say really quickly, I think that what you're saying about appeals and needing to have due process around appeals is especially important in a system that is arbitrary in the way that it's going to, how do I put this, like, convict people depending on both the race of their victims and their own race. Yep. And
3.5% more likely to be convicted if it's a white victim. Yeah,
I've read the same statistic, and I've been sort of privy to similar. And also, people can have forced confessions such that they're confessing, but they don't actually know what they're confessing to. And in general, people are being capable of being just completely maligned and wrongly positioned and pushed into conditions where they're on death row, which I think is actually a huge psychic harm to innocent people as well. That's just terrible. And that the appeal process is very important within the context of that system. However, I worry that in terms of my argument, at least, which is focused on the more practical and kind of volleys back and forth with what Sunday is saying, is that that's going to be shifting the goalpost slightly, because clearly the demandingness concern. So one of the concerns that's coming up for everybody that I want to just highlight, because I think it's stuff that we should be carrying forward into future discussions, is the demandingness concern about conviction. How do we know we have sufficient knowledge? What about the reversibility condition? What allows us to assume a certain stance about the permissibility of certain types of punishments over other punishments? How do we know what's the demandingness around determining what causes maximum suffering, what makes things unique? These are all questions that are going to be useful and fruitful from this debate that can be carried forward. But I think the appeal question is relevant for current circumstances in which exponentially quantum more people are on death row or in these circumstances than Sunday or I would ever want to imagine any other world.
Yes.
And so that's an issue that's endemic and important to these circumstances. I know I myself thoroughly agree with everything you just said. The point that I'm trying to raise, though, and it could, and you know, what's the word? It's just one second. Distinction without difference. The reason why what I'm saying isn't just merely a distinction without difference is I'm still not convinced on this arbitrary. I'm still not convinced that in terms of like different state meted out punishments, that there isn't some arbitrariness around how we consider irreversibility unique, how we consider capital punishment in particular unique, et cetera, if we were to be much more stringent and careful about the overall conditions than we were in this world. And so the appeal conditions are the appeal conditions within this world. So again, like here's a question for you. This might seem like a silly thought experiment, but I believe it's actually not, because I think it gets at what's at stake in capital punishment in particular. Do you believe there could be a fully rehabilitative system akin to the one established in like the Northern European model, but way advanced into the future, in that rare lightning bolt, very specific, like once in 100 years instance, capital punishment would still be on the table? Do you think those two things could ever exist simultaneously? So there's a question.
Could they exist, or would I want it to exist? What do you mean?
Could they?
Could
is
they?
Is it even morally commensurable?
Is it morally okay? So I would not want it to, because it doesn't match what I would say in my moral system. But I could see it existing. I could see because again, like everything that I look at suggests that the death penalty just doesn't have an effect on like deterrence. So I could see someone building this reformative system, but kind of cudgeling it into it. I could see that happening, but I think it's a counterance to the idea of reform.
So, yeah, so this is the difficulty that I'm primarily having here. We agree on the practicalities almost to a T. The difficulty here is that your moral objections seem to rest, and I'm directing this to both Dylan and Ben, seem to rest on total insensibility to all of the psychological and spiritual harm that results from having people who gleefully take pride in their crimes continue to exist bodily in prison into perpetuity. I mean, it seems to be a moral sense that completely disregards any value in human beings except for their biological continuity, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, except that there's absolutely nothing that either of us have said that even hinted at this. Is like the sixth time that you've attributed that to us, but you're pulling that out of thin air. I don't understand where you take yourself to be getting this idea that there's no, that we don't think there's such a thing as, psychological harms, that they have if you think that one of the inalienable rights.
Dylan earlier was perfectly fine saying that he actually wanted people in prison to live for a long time with the knowledge of their crimes and suffer for it.
I specifically said.
I agree.
I specifically said
there's no
whatsoever. Let's hear from Dylan.
I specifically said that when it came to people like Adolf Hitler, and the other example I gave was my rapist. Was that I would much rather them reflect on what they have done within the criminal justice system. Now, if I suggest, maybe I didn't give enough detail to it, but it wasn't under the idea that I want them forever to just like suffer forever. Now, there might be some primal urge within me that makes me think like Adolf Hitler suffering, I don't care. It's Adolf Hitler, right? But I think that the system should be built around the idea of even attempting to reform the biggest monsters, even though in 99% of cases it'll be pointless, because I think building the system around reform and the idea of reform and results in much better results.
So what I'm trying to do with the practical angle that I'm taking is I'm saying that, look, the moral contention that Sunday is bringing up, whether or not you believe he's correctly attributing it to some aspect of what you said or not, maintains, which is basically that this is a situation in which we would have to disregard most certain moral intuitions people have about what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes justice, what constitutes allowing, somebody who is genuinely monstrous across any empirical, across any rare circumstantial situatedness to be to still be criminal. Like, in other words, he's saying that there could be instances, no matter how rare and how bizarre they may be, and how much evidence we'd have to bring to bear in the demandingness around that, whereby the person was still fully and completely remorseless, and we could really locate them with the crime. And if those things were to be more or less met, there would be some kind of moral onus that would potentially emerge, and there would be a common notion that that moral onus entailed ensuring that that person no longer existed in society in such a way as they could continue to cause harm or torment or do things, or in which they could even be left to suffer in some bizarre way over a prolonged period of time. And so the practical aspect of that concern is what then makes these questions around capital punishment in particular and irreversibility unique. And another issue that might come up around irreversibility is that, so there's irreversibility concerns in general, and the suffering that's caused as a result of assuming that someone committed a crime to the people who are the living leftover family and people who are associated with the victim of that crime continues for a very long period of time, even if it turns out that the person who committed the crime was innocent. And so then yet again, I want to double down and say the real issue here is that we have to be very careful and very demanding in how we actually convict people of crimes in the first place. And a lot of these concerns about irreversibility in the very rare specific case where that would still be a concern would be diminished. And so there's just a moral intuition that's common among people that if we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that something is the case, that capital punishment isn't at least worse than other forms of punishment if we were able to actually determine that that person had done something, right? So he's coming up with a moral intuition that is a common and important one and well founded, right? In some
there's a moral intuition about what the people might be justified to prevent the harm of the person who's bragging about their crimes and thus causing psychological torment to others. There's also a epistemic intuition that it would be possible to eliminate uncertainty, and I think the epistemic intuition doesn't deserve any weight at all, because we know that that's just flatly not true. And even if it's a extremely tiny sliver of an uncertainty, that still does lead to what I'd regard as a really significant and powerful disanalogy between the death penalty and life in prison. That in the case of life in prison, you can have a sentence that's been partially carried out, but have the rest of it not be carried out. And again, I think when it comes to the idea that it might be kinder to people, that like, me and Dylan, only care about people's bodies. We don't care about psychological torment. By the way, of course we care about psychological torment. What a bizarre thing to attribute to us.
Yeah, I'm not making that claim, but yeah.
Okay, Sunday made it several times, but they have but as far as that goes, when it comes to which is worse, then that I think we should ask the victims of either. Do we as a matter of fact, overwhelmingly. Most prisoners possibly facing the death penalty overwhelmingly prefer more decades in prison to the death penalty. Overwhelmingly, people in prison, for decades think that they are having a worthwhile life. When they get out for decades. I just see no reason to second guess either one. And I did just want to really quick circle around to say that on this subject of psychological harm, it would be interesting to think about the case of somebody who hasn't, who didn't commit the crime, doesn't claim to have committed the crime, but who constantly torments those around him by talking about how awesome and amazing the crime was, how this person the victim totally deserved to be raped and murdered, etc. And if that person is in prison for another offense, an offense that would not be considered, would not rise to the level of capital punishment, I'd be very curious about whether somebody who was causing just as much psychic harm by never shutting up about how awesome the crime was and how much the victim had it coming and laughing about it, whether that person should also.
But that's, Ben, that's a complete non sequitur, though. The point isn't that it's just causing psychological harm. The point is that it's also effacing the dignity of the person they killed.
Well, it's not a non sequitur.
Families who lost the future.
Repeatedly brought up the psychological
Ben, I'm still talking.
harm. It might not address the entirety of your argument. Doesn't make it a non sequitur.
Okay, and additionally, you keep bringing up that people in prison would prefer to live out the rest of their lives in prison as opposed to being executed for their crimes. Why is that a factor? Like, you haven't
it's a factor because we're presented with the argument that it's kinder to them.
Neither of us have said that it's actually kinder. I don't believe. I think what we've said. Slow down. I'm not done. That was how Jama ended her opening statement, and also no. Jama didn't say.
Well,
Jama did not
do
say.
This just to have order. Why don't we do maybe 2 minutes with President Sunday, and then we'll give 2 minutes to Ben to respond, and
Sure.
that way we're.
I just need a few seconds. Jama didn't say that prison was kinder. Jama said that we can't just have this simplistic idea that because death is final, therefore it is kinder than, therefore prison is kinder. That was the argument. She wasn't saying that death is a kindness to prisoners. In some cases, of course, like with practical situations where people have been falsely accused and spent upwards of 7 to 10 years on death row, it is not a kindness, because they can still live their lives afterwards as innocent men. But we're not just talking about human beings as being engines of pleasure, wherein the only thing that matters is how much fresh air they breathe and how much nice food they have and how many free walks they go on. There is the additional factor that we don't actually ask them when we put them into prison. When we keep a murderer who is unapologetic and in fact takes pride in what he has done in prison for an interminable length of time, in the vain hope that at some point we can force his mind to change so that he feels remorse, we are not treating him as a human being with human dignity. We devalue him and frankly every other human being in addition to that. We treat him as a will-less body to be hijacked by the state. That's not a kindness. That's not mercy. That's killing the man in soul before he dies bodily, and then spitting on his grave because he wasn't even a human.
I want to give Ben the same amount of time, which is about 1.5 minutes, and then hopefully before we go into the Q&A, if you guys want to keep going, I'm open to it, but we usually would be pretty soon going into the Q&A, but hopefully we can hear from Dylan as well as Jama yet before we do that. So, but go ahead, Ben, first.
Okay, so there have been many suggestions that it would be a kindness to prisoners to execute them rather than keeping them in prison. The explanation we just heard of why Jama wasn't saying that was confusing. That it was that she's not saying it's a kindness; she's just saying it's not necessarily.
Oh, by the way, I go by they, not she. So just throwing that out.
My apologies.
Sorry,
okay.
no, that's yeah.
Okay, yeah, not intentional. Okay.
No, of course not. I totally not a problem.
I think I might have done that first. My apologies.
Yeah, you did Sunday. Okay.
But if they were suggesting that we can't necessarily assume that it would be kinder to keep them in prison, like rather than saying that it's kinder, at the very least, the idea that it's kinder to kill people was being suggested as a possibility. In fact, that was really in the opening statement the only positive argument for the death penalty that I heard. And from Sunday, we've had several suggestions that Dylan and I are saying that don't care about psychological harm, torturing people, by keeping them in prison. We only care about killing their bodies, which again suggests that it would be a kindness to prisoners to execute them. So that's what was being pushed back against there. As far as the question of human dignity goes, I would say two things. One, that the two issues, keeping somebody alive and holding out hope for repentance, can be broken apart. That they have that it would, because you think that somebody is a human being with certain innate rights, that means that you do not have the right to take their life, even if they will never repent. Also, though, on the subject of repentance, I would say that what deprives someone of their dignity, what treats them as a willless body, is precisely saying that because their current attitude is gleeful and mocking, there is no chance that they will ever be morally rehabilitated.
Thanks so much. And then, as mentioned, we'd love to hear from you both as well before we do wrap up, but no obligation if you don't have anything to add before we do go to Q&A, Dylan and Jama.
I think I'm just going to add on my side that in general, I want the opposition and everyone to keep in mind that we were working with an in principle and in practice distinction. And of course, as these things actually play out, discussing real systems and institutions and structures that exist right now, that distinction ends up becoming murkier and murkier. And so the claim that something in practice is not only not, morally, is not only something that could not be dealt on the basis of any moral authority that could deal it being illegitimate, on the basis of its arbitrariness, its discriminatory practices, etc., as well as the claim that the way in which it's dealt forces us to consider concerns around ensuring appeals exist, is one set of claims. Relating to that set of claims are the ideas of demandingness. How do we actually know we know? Is empirical evidence sufficient? Is justified true belief about something sufficient? Are we able to reverse decisions we make about what we know? These are all concerns that we have immediately in the here and now in a terribly morally corrupt system in which many, many more people are dealt this severe punishment compared to other punishments, compared to another, let's say, more ideal system. That's one set of claims. Whether in principle, this type of punishment ought to not be on the table compared to other severe, quotes, state sanctioned style punishments, and whether or not, and without even considering the lex talionis argument, whether there's something uniquely strange and awful in principle, is a whole other set of considerations. One point that I do want to make that I think is extremely important is that when we consider the possibility that capital punishment may still in principle be a possibility, even if there are no instances in the current system in which we would actually utilize it or should utilize it or could utilize it, we are forced to then consider what's morally at stake for everybody involved in what happens to a person who, for instance, we may know in this more ideal mode, let's say we were able to know is guilty. We also know that we may not be able to know that, and that becomes yet another practical concern. But I think that we still have yet to establish what is unique about capital punishment in principle to an adequate extent, despite the fact that all these practical, such that we would never even consider it, especially given that there might be morally compelling reasons from a certain view, particularly deontological, kind of enriched contractarian view about the nature of people's dignity and soul past death and what might actually be at stake for victims and the rest of it. We still haven't really considered in principle what is unique about this punishment in particular. In practice, I think we agree on a lot. And so that's basically the summation final remarks I would make on my side, just to kind of summarize my position. So I want to keep that principle practice distinction in mind.
Thanks for your patience. And if you'd like to hear more from Jama or anyone here, want to let you know, folks, all of our guests are linked in the description. Now's a great opportunity, and we'll give it over to Dylan before we do go into the Q&A. Dylan, the floor is all yours.
So I just want to note, and I know nobody's disagreeing with me, but I would like to note this for the people at home, that it seems that nobody here has disagreed with the problems with how with the death penalty in the United States. The amount of innocent people that it kills every year, and with the state-sanctioned killing of these individuals, its racist application on how when the victims are white, the sentencing rate is much higher, and when the perpetrators are black, the sentencing rates are much higher. how there has been no evidence of deterrence throughout other countries. When you compare countries that have the death penalty or don't have the death penalty, you cannot find data to show that the countries with the death penalty have lower crime rates anywhere. The same thing is applicable to the United States when you compare states. We can talk about how this idea of a kind of revenge-based system that many people use to justify the death penalty has led to us having the 20% of the world's prison population with only 5 to 6% of the world's population. And it has been a tool of authoritarians around the world. And when you look at the states that usually value freedom and democracy, they have started to fade more and more away with it as their criminal justice systems have become more accurate and more effective in bringing about reform. So I just wanted to make these points very clear, that it seems that nobody here even disagrees on these points. And so for even if we could find a scenario, which we haven't been able to agree upon today, but even if we could all find a scenario where we all agree that this penalty in some hypothetical perfect world of applications could be applicable in the United States to stop the disproportionate use against black people, to stop the state-sanctioned killing of innocent people, to stop the horrendously high cost it takes to execute people, and to allow people who are innocent to re-enter society, hopefully one day, and to not have this wasteful amount of money being dumped into something that has no deterrence effects whatsoever, we should abolish the death penalty.
You got it. Thank you very much. We will jump into this Q&A. I want to say thanks to everybody for your questions. Nikolai, starting with yours, thanks very much, said, for Dr. Ben, and I think they mean for Dylan, they said, is there an instance in which you would advocate for a life sentence as opposed to correctional programs and rehabilitation? If yes, what is that threshold and who decides?
Ben, you can go first if you want.
Sure. So I guess, are there instances in which I would say there should be a life? Actually, I'm sorry. Can you clarify? So what? Like, I want to make sure I have the wording right. That there be a life sentence as opposed to.
Right. I
Do
think
they mean life without parole? Do they mean that? Like the idea that they couldn't? Like what exactly?
Okay.
Yeah,
that could be.
I think maybe it's even a life sentence in both cases. It's just that in one you have like the person's going through correctional programs, and no, that doesn't seem to make sense.
Okay, so I think Dylan's probably right. Probably
Yeah.
what the questioner is getting at is are there circumstances in which I would advocate that people be sentenced to life without parole as opposed to like 20 to life, and
Thank you.
And I would say no. I think that I think that when you come up with the cases, if only for pragmatic reasons, by which I mean like when you come up with the cases that intuitively you say, okay, we're not losing anything here by throwing away the key, your Jeffrey Dahmers and whatnot, then that sure, those people should never ever get out. Well, one, I don't really see the downside to having it be 20 to life as opposed to life without parole, because I'm very unworried about any parole board ever deciding to let out the Jeffrey Dahmer type, the Manson type. And this goes back to a point that, that came up repeatedly throughout the debate. I think that that if we're crafting rules, we don't just want those rules to be able to satisfy our intuitions in some cases. We want to think hard about what those rules are going to lead to in practice. And I would much rather err on the side of giving everybody meaningless parole hearing, like everybody parole hearings, even if for the Dahmer types, those parole hearings will be totally meaningless because there's zero chance they'll ever be let out, then err on the side of not letting some people who genuinely might be rehabilitated have parole hearings.
Gotcha. And thank you very much. This question coming in from, oh wait, Dylan, if you wanted to add to that, you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to make clear that I want to emphasize everything Ben said, but also add the point that I don't see the point of doing it without parole, because if it finds out that we've been able to actually reform somebody to a point where they can re-enter society, then I wouldn't see the harm in releasing them when it comes to when we talk about the American system. preserving the individual's ability, as long as they are not going to be a harm to others, to allow them to interact with society. Of course, you could talk about the psychological effects it could have on the surrounding community, but I think a lot of times making that argument could completely upend the entirety of allowing anybody who's committed a horrific crime ever from re-entering society. So yeah, there we go.
You got it. Thanks very much. And then thanks for your question. This one from Chris Gammon and Nikolai had a similar question in which they asked everybody to answer this. So I'll read Chris Gammon's. What do you think about banning the death penalty, but allowing people sentenced to life in prison to opt for the death penalty? Or you could say a form of assisted suicide, as Nikolai says, if they wanted to.
Is that for everybody, or?
That's right.
It seems fine to me. I mean, if somebody, I don't have a, if somebody believes that their confinement and inability to move freely, which it would have to happen when you imprison somebody to try to protect the rest of society from them, and they want to choose to end their own life, I believe, they have the autonomy over themselves to make that decision. As long, I do think they should have to consult with multiple doctors beforehand to make sure that they really are sure about this decision. But I don't have any personal objection.
I'm unsure about where I would stand on this. I think that a punishment that was meted out by a state on an individual on the basis of them having violated some aspect of the social contract between the two, if you want to take that frame, for instance, or you want to kind of look at it as something that's been sort of superimposed, and then allowing the individual just kind of freely adjudicate what to do with that, instead of ensuring that the punishment was delivered in a way completely different than our current system. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know what the moral status of that is, or whether that should be something that should then be put back onto the individual when it was formerly sort of the role of the state. So I'm going to remain agnostic about that because I need to think about that one further.
Anybody else?
Ben, after you.
Sure. I am also unsure about how I'd feel about that. I think that the circumstances in which suicide should be legal are, I mean, like that's a very tricky issue. I mean, I think that, there are cases that seem pretty clear to me. Like the end stage patient with an incurable disease, who still has all their faculties about them, but wants to end the suffering, etc. Like those cases are pretty clear to me. How far I'd want to extend that, I just have to think about that a lot more. But so as to not be seen as evading the question, I will say at least that what I am sure about is that I would be much less bothered by simply allowing people the option of killing themselves, perhaps with assistance, than I would be by the state asserting ownership over them by killing them.
I would just like to note the disturbing way in which all of a sudden, because a prisoner is offered the opportunity to end their life voluntarily, that we therefore completely ignore the fact that they have been imprisoned involuntarily, and by the for all of the same reasons that have been brought up ad nauseum in this debate, we are equally unsure to a cosmic degree that they have in fact committed the crime for which they are in prison.
Gotcha. And want to let you know, folks, something totally weird that I've never seen happen before is happening in the live chat right now. Oliver Catwell is a moderator gone rogue who I can't like tag him. I don't know. I'm going to try. It has to be a bug because I know the person behind it. But anyway, everybody's basically being hidden in the chat right now. Something's wrong. So folks, I promise we will unhide you. And honestly, I think it's a bug because I know the person behind that account. He's actually a kind person. So there's got to be something funky going on and I will fix it. So bear with us, folks, if you've just been deleted from the chat. And we're going to jump into the next question while I work on that. Thanks for your question, Jamie Russell. Let's see. Kind of more of a quick statement in terms of asking, do you have like a short and pithy response from Ben and Dylan until they're saying, in the case of brutal killings, we'll give you a chance to maybe just say, in those cases of the most brutal killings, what's kind of I hate saying to ask you to keep it pithy, but their question is short. And so we'll give you a chance to respond to that.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
why is it not okay to do the death penalty? And I think if you want to address kind of the objection of like brutal killings.
Okay,
I can give you an example. Actually, there's an example of a case, and again, this would be if we're talking. I like an argument of practicality. I know Ben will make an argument from philosophy, so we can tag team it. One example would be in the 1930s, there was a disabled man that a crime was pinned on. That was a brutal axe murder and rape of a woman. The man was so horribly mentally disabled that on the way, when he was bringing away to be executed, he handed his toy train to the guard, the toy train he would usually play with the other prisoners who really liked the person, to the guard and said, "Hey, can you hold this to me? I'll be right back," before he was executed. A few years later, it was found out that he obviously was not guilty. And so I would say the same problem I would have with the murder, the state ending up killing innocent people and it being pinned a lot of times, higher conviction rates on black people and disabled people being taken advantage of would all be concerns from practicality. And I'll let Ben take it from a philosophy point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that even if you have a sort of retributive principle that says that whatever the worst punishment is the one that should be meted out on the people who've committed the most brutal, the most heinous killings. This is where I ended my opening statement. That just leaves open the question of what that punishment should be, which, by the way, also doubles for the social contract arguments, because if you think that people have implicitly accepted whatever the legal punishment is, okay, great, but that only comes into operation what we've decided what the maximum legal punishment would be. And I think that if you think that people have innate human dignity and there are things that you cannot do to them, you can do things to prevent them from being from being a danger to society, but there are things that you can't do to them, just like you can't cut their noses off. I think that you can't kill them.
You got it. Thanks very much. And folks, thanks for your patience in the chat. I have demodded Oliver Catwell temporarily until we figure out what's going on. Ryan Wallace, thanks for your question. This one's for you, Dylan. How do you feel about the death penalty for cat girls? What's a cat girl?
You're muted, Dylan.
I had not considered this possibility, and I think there might be one exception to my death penalty example: catboy supremacy. Okay, thank you. Continue.
Thank you very much. Lil Kim, thanks for your question. Said, kind of a objection question, said the Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to execute the intellectually disabled because it's cruel and unusual. So doesn't that speak to the death penalty being the less humane option? I guess we'll give you a chance, President, as well as Jama, if you want to respond.
Sure. It's the less humane option. Well, I think what it speaks to in particular is that it's an option that's appropriate only for people with full agency as a response to a fully agential action. I mean, I agree with the ruling 100%. Jama, did you want to go? I think this actually speaks to what you were saying initially.
No, I would agree with that. And I would say that, like, basically then one has to figure out the agency of somebody in that situation in terms of imprisoning them, period, in terms of anything that would occur in relation to them that wouldn't be strictly rehabilitative. So I think that's a broader question. I think it does relate to the nature of agency. So I would just back that up.
If I can comment secondly as well, I think this should be applied across the board for people of that description. I mean, prison as well is equally cruel in this respect. So I don't think, we shouldn't be treating that as a minor distinction here. So, it's okay, I'll just go to prison. Anyways.
Gotcha. Thanks very much for your question. This one coming in from Will Stewart says, Dylan, let's say a dippy murders 5 baby hippies and eats their brains live on Twitch. Why should society now become financially responsible for him for the next 50 years? Would it not be a net benefit to execute them?
Oh.
It ends up actually usually a lot of times costing more to execute an individual than it does to actually house them throughout their life. There are certain cases where if you get to the like for example, if somebody did it at 18, then possibly if they live to like 102, you might be able to get to the math where it might end up at the end of the day costing more. But for example, and this is the experience I have it from, it cost $37 million to execute one person in the state of Maryland last time we did it. And that's from like the 70s and 80s. So if you account for inflation there, that's that's a chunk of change. So it actually can be quite expensive to execute people as well. So I find the cost saving argument not really effective.
Gotcha. And thanks, Zirafa, for your
Can I quickly just respond to that as well?
You bet.
Yeah. I agree with what Dylan said, which is accurate, but I also think at the same time, questions of justice aren't exhausted by cost, and that goes in both directions. If it was in fact cheaper to kill them, that wouldn't be an argument in favor of the death penalty either. Sorry, please keep going.
Well, also, I think it's also important that in the case, this is the argument against the deterrence claim that people often make in relation to being in favor of capital punishment, which is that, look, you can't be offloading onto a third party considerations that are meant to be strictly between the person meting out the punishment and the person who is receiving the punishment. And so this is yet another instance of talking about something that should not be relevant in the consideration of what to do in relation to someone who is up for punishment. So I think it's actually really an unethical way of approaching it, not on the part of the commentator, but in overall structural sense.
You got it. Thanks very much for your question. Zirafa Deep, they say, thanks for the debate, everybody. And question for all, you're about to be executed for a crime you didn't commit. Your last thoughts in words, what are they?
So long, and thanks for all the fish. I don't know.
All right, now I like Sunday.
I like
that's all
that pussy hit different.
I don't think that pussy hit different, but I think something along the lines of, well, this shit is fucked. Good thing I wrote my memoir. And that'll be the end of it.
Thank you very much.
Happen to anyone else.
What was it?
Don't let this happen to anyone else.
Thank you very much for your question. Lewis Barnett said, what system best brings justice to the victims?
I think reformative systems are probably the best because ultimately they produce the least amount of victims. When you have a system that's based upon our current system is like high rates of reincarceration. We do not invest the time and effort into prisoners as we want. The private prison industry is extremely barbaric and not getting prisoners not only assistance in like trying to actually re-enter them properly into society when they leave so they don't fall into the same functions, but even like giving them basic nutritional health. There's a lot of instances of private prison companies cutting when it comes to like food, and they'll end up actually serving legitimately just moldy food to prisoners. And so if we actually want somebody to re-enter society as a productive member, we need to start treating them like they have the respect of a member of society. And so I think reformative systems are the best ways to give victims justice, because as somebody who has, I guess this is personal, but as somebody who's been a victim of quite violent and horrific crimes, the best way for me to have justice is to know that it's happening to the least amount of people as physically possible, and nobody has to go through that stuff again.
I just want to back up that last claim that Dylan made in strong terms and say that I think that's entirely, courageous and morally appropriate as a statement. And I myself am a huge fan of rehabilitative style systems for a similar reason. I think that we have a moral duty and responsibility to pour our resources into rehabilitating people wherever and whenever we can, and that this is going to be the main thing that improves the structure and nature of society, as well as, of course, eliminating systemic injustice. So I'm a huge fan of rehabilitation, and I think that it actually creates the social conditions such that victims are able to live in a better world.
You got it.
I would just really quickly add to that. I mean, I agree with everything that that both Dylan and Jama said, but I would add that, Jama brought this up earlier, whether it would be possible to have a system like that and still rarely apply, still have the death penalty on the books, but, and sometimes applied, but very rarely. And I think it might be possible, but I think realistically it's deeply unlikely. I think that the kind of changes in societal attitudes towards crime that would get us the kind of system that Dylan and Jama are advocating are ones that it's very hard to imagine that happening without them being accompanied by the abolition of the death penalty.
I did want to also add that earlier, like I talked about, there are numbers to back this up, that when it comes to getting people justice and this feeling of like, we can start to heal, frying the guy or frying the woman, frying whoever they were, rarely helps, if at all. And a lot of times there's this moment of like, I wanted it to bring them back and it didn't bring them back. It can actually be a moment of kind of reflective sadness. So I think even if you wanted to get this idea, well, it'll emotionally help them heal, a lot of times it doesn't.
Thank you very much. We'll jump to this next question from
Oh, hang on, I
Farron
haven't answered
Salas.
yet.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so, well, I'm going to echo that I am also very much in favor of a restorative system with Jama, Dylan, and Ben. It's also important to note that justice is not exhausted by harm reduction or by psychological healing. There are other things in play. Yeah, that's all I'll say on that. I'm exhausted. Go on.
You got it. And thanks for your question. Farron Salas says, thanks, James, Ben, Dylan, President Sunday, and Jama for your time and preparation this evening. Crushed it. I couldn't agree more. This, honestly, people really enjoyed this in the chat. And so thanks so much to our speakers. And another one from Will Stewart says, Ben and Dylan, if it is immoral or unjust for the state to execute, is it also therefore moral and unjust for one to protect their life through lethal force in self-defense?
No.
I
mean, I think again the disanalogy. This is how I started my opening statement. Is between killing in self-defense when your only options are to kill or be killed, and killing a well-secured prisoner who you could keep everybody safe from without killing them.
I'm a known supporter of the Second Amendment. My household is a firearm household. No, I don't think so. I think the difference would be in those scenarios that we're talking about. I can't exactly properly confine the person into a rigid, no, if they're trying to kill me, then I don't have many options. Whereas when somebody's confined and no longer a threat, we have the option of confinement.
Gotcha. And thank you very much for your question. This one coming in from, by the way, let's see, Lord Bryant says, hello, President Sunday. And then Big Thang Bruce Wayne, thank you for your question, says, should the death penalty include economic criminals? White-collar criminals do more damage to society than violent individuals.
For me, it's still the same. No, I don't death penalty, but I think this would be something for Sunday and the other.
What do you think, Sunday and Jama?
Well, it's directed to you, Sunday, so go first.
That's actually a difficult question. I don't, but I intuitively know. I'm just trying to think through.
Sorry, could you read
it? That one's tricky. I think it would almost be like, I would have to confess that that's a major overstep if the state were to make that kind of decision. Sorry, Jama, what were you saying?
I just wanted to hear the question again really quickly.
You bet. They said, should the death penalty include economic criminals? White-collar criminals do more damage to society than violent individuals, oftentimes.
Well, I think crucially, we weren't making a retributive argument, so that's not really a factor here. We weren't making a deterrent one either. The point was, in the event where you have a person whose continued existence for whom prolonging their continued existence was also to prolong a pernicious activity that was causing harm and dishonor to their victims and their victims' families, that would be an appropriate situation.
But you could,
the bare fact that someone's caused damage.
So, just to also answer that really quickly, because I'm kind of in the same general side. Sorry, is that okay, Ben? I'm just gonna jump in quickly.
Oh yeah, I'll wait.
Okay, all right. So basically, what I would say is that I don't think talking about distal, overall, large-scale, mass-scale harms, wherein we're talking about the actual downstream or tertiary or secondary effect of a specific action, should have a punishment that is directed typically towards a specific firsthand thing. So like, if it's like, so what I'm saying is like, in that basis, like, we're really stretching the limits of things, and we want to be able to keep this as morally, on moral and legal grounds, as specific to the person and the actions and the party that the person committed the actions knowingly and, with malice and forethought, presumably, or whatever else we want to say. we want to keep it as narrow as possible, because there's a point at which then we start, and again, like, I don't know why that, in the rare instance in which capital punishment would be the way of dealing with the situation, why in that instance in particular you would be going after a white collar criminal whose actions had led to many deaths, because that's also letting die versus murdering. If that white collar criminal had gone in and directly murdered a bunch of people in a specific way and managed to get extraordinary reach in that process, or people had been used by him as his arm or something, then maybe there's another reanalysis that could occur. But again, like, the distinction between murdering and letting die is one. The one about the direct consequences and effects of individual actions on a person and the moral status associated with that is another. I just think it'd be a very strange way to a strange place to start with capital punishment, the very, very extremely rare once in 100 years instance where that would actually happen. So I think that'd be strange.
And if I can just jump back in really quickly, just for clarification, the argument wasn't that a person did something really, really bad and therefore should be killed for it. The argument was, if this is the only thing that is left to us in order to terminate an ongoing pernicious activity, that would be a case. So, I mean, it just doesn't seem like an analogous case.
But that's the part I don't understand, because it seems like, given the sort of scenario that you have in mind, it would be no problem at all to concoct a version of that for white collar crimes. I mean, like, and we can look. I mean, we can think of like many real instances. You know, we can think about the Enron executives laughing over the phone about the rolling blackouts they were engineering in California. We can think of the managers at Tyson Chicken who in like office jobs who actually had a betting pool about how many of their workers would contract COVID. And so it shouldn't be any stretch of the imagination to imagine somebody who's been imprisoned for an economic crime that led to massive amounts of suffering, constantly tormenting those around them by bragging about all the suffering they'd caused, by mocking their victims, by talking about how hilarious they found it that somebody whose pension they took away wasn't able to pay for their kids' insulin. I don't really see the disanalogy.
Well, okay, that's an important point. I think the disanalogy rests in the nature of the thing about which they are bragging. I think there is something qualitatively distinct about rape and murder in particular that is not carried over to the kinds of admittedly heinous things that you're referring to. I'm actually a little bit ambiguous on this now. I mean, truth be told, I think at this stage I'd have to think about it more. I think I'm largely just uncomfortable with the idea of killing people for those specific kinds of crimes, because it seems to require a different kind of activity on the part of the perpetrator than rape and murder do.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I would say too. There could be a distinction again also between like being really vicious and hideous and evil and letting people die and being in a position of power to and being able to enact things, and capital punishment being one in a rare instance of set of conditions whereby somebody had committed individually specific acts that were in the realm of murdering specific people in a specific context instead of letting them die, and then all the demandingness conditions, everything else we talked about actually obtained in that case. That seems like a unique and specific sort of thing. That being said, I'm not 100% on this either, and I also want to make it clear that the distinction isn't between retribution on the one hand and one where we couldn't really figure out how to engage in retribution. Like we're not supporting retribution at all necessarily, and saying that there might be something unique about murder that ought to be considered in a bunch of different lights. It doesn't have to be a retribution light that we consider it in. And we also need to have another think about what constitutes murder, what constitutes downstream effects, what constitutes deliberateness in actions. This is a bunch of philosophical problems, like trolley problem level, right?
And if I can just jump in quickly, as if to illustrate,
really,
I have absolutely no problem.
Super short response. Then I got to.
I have no problem saying whatsoever that such a person equally deserves to die. So it's not a matter of retribution.
Next up, thanks very much. Brenton Langle is in the house. Good to see you, Brenton. Oh, that's right. So I got to remind you guys, we are very excited. As you guys, you don't want to miss it. It's going to be epic. On the bottom right of your screen, there he is. Brenton will be taking on Destiny, and that will be a lot of fun. And so we hope you make it Friday. Brenton says, everyone be sure to check out Ben's Give Them an Argument, and namely podcast and YouTube channel, both, right, Ben?
Mm-hmm.
And then also Dylan's Hippy Dippy Roundtable. And I got to tell you guys, I mean, I want to encourage you to go to all the links of all the speakers that we have on tonight, especially this has been a joy. You guys have all been really civil, and it's been fun and enthusiastic. And I also want to mention Dylan Burns. I love, is it fair to say it's a debate channel? And I have to say, I love your showmanship. It's very fun. So yes, our guests are linked in the description. Oh, absolutely. And so I want to encourage you folks to check out our guests that are linked in the description. Oh, it's just one click away. And Spider the Ateo, thanks for your question. Oh, wait, one Invisible Ninja first said, here is a little something to help grow the channel. Gave extra. So glad Ben is back. Thanks so much for your support. And yes, we do appreciate Ben and all the other speakers. Thank you very much. And Spider the Ateo, thanks for your question, said, was it okay to execute Gordon Prescott in 1926?
I don't know who that is, but if he was a well-secured prisoner, no, it was not okay to execute him.
Yep.
Thanks to Ben and Dylan for jumping off the diving board. First of all, I also don't know who that is or what was going on, so I can't really speak to that.
Identical, yeah. I'm not sure of the context.
Yeah, that's same here. I'm in the same boat. And let me see if there was anyone. Let's see. That is it for our questions. We do want to give a huge thank you to our guests. We really do appreciate them. It's been a total blast. And thanks everybody out there for your support. Super encouraged to just hang out with everybody tonight. Both, I should say, all of our speakers as well as everybody in the chat. Thanks for hanging out with us. And so I will be back in just a moment with a post-credit scene about upcoming debates. So stick around, folks. And one last thank you, though, to Ben, Dylan, President Sunday, and Jama. It's been a true pleasure to have you.
Props to
Wonderful.
Props to Sunday for the Douglas Adams reference.
You all have a blessed one.
Thank you so much, James. It was really lovely being on.
Yeah, thank you, James and Ben and Burgis. It was actually a pleasure. Got a bit heated, but I respect what you guys do, and it was fun.
Yeah, had a great time too. Yeah. Take care.
Thank you. And we'll be back in just a moment, folks. Thanks so much. All right, we're in the backstage. Thanks so much. It's been a true pleasure. And what if it's useful to you, what I usually do is I send a Google Drive link, and I put the debate video file inside of it. And if you want to upload it or use it in whatever way you want, feel free. And yeah, so, and that's as soon as you want too. So you don't have to wait, any sort of time, like whenever you want to upload it, feel free to, if you'd like that copy.
Wonderful. Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, James, that reminds me. Did you ever send me the Friedman one?
You're right. I think I'm behind. Sorry, but
No
I will.
I just wanted to check in case I'd lost the email or something.
I'm happy to do that. Thanks for that reminder, Ben. I'm going to write it down right now, because if you know me, I have to write it down or it's rolling the dice. But yeah, so thank you guys. And if you thank you all. If you have a link you'd like me to add to the description, as mentioned, even if it's down the road, for real, I'm happy to add it, even if it's like a year or 10 years, whatever. So thanks for coming on.
Okay, thanks so much.
Have a good one.
Take care. Have a great night.
All right, take care.